I'm going to start by introducing Francesco. He's the head of communications at the IRI. His writing and photography focuses on how the world's most vulnerable people struggle with droughts, extreme weather, epidemics, and other climate risks, and what science is doing about it. He recently joined the advisory board of Planet Forward, a nonprofit that provides ideas to solve global environmental challenges. He is the co-creator of the 2014 Climate Models Calendar, a crowdfunded project that turns climate scientists into fashion models. Before joining IRI, Francesco was an editor in the Wall Street Journal's news graphics group. So take it away.
Oh, I think you.
Sorry.
All right, so it's a little warm in here. I'm kind of feeling a little drowsy at the moment because I just ate lunch and haven't had coffee. But no fear, because the topic that we're going to discuss on this panel is, well, I think it's the best one. And it's for two reasons. One is that as I look around the audience, but also throughout the conference, I know that so many of us here have chosen to do what we do and be involved in our organizations because we fundamentally believe that science could and should be used for society's benefit, to improve outcomes, to keep children from dying of starvation, to protect families from extreme weather in their homes, to keep New York City from going underwater, to all the way up to just protecting our economies from climate shocks. And also when I mean science for society, it's also not in a trickle-down way, right? Not sort of particle physics to microwave oven. It's in a very direct way. And it's the outcome science that Mike Crow talked about yesterday in his video. So science benefits society, it's a force for good, and we want the benefits to keep increasing. And the second reason why we don't really need our coffee right at this moment is because the panelists here have promised me they're going to be a raucous bunch, throwing down some strong opinions, maybe poking and prodding you all in the audience for some reactions. And before we get started, I just kind of want to throw out a straw man, and that's from the presentations and the panels that we've been hearing. We learned that our models are improving over time, our forecasting has improved since the 97-98 El Nino. The quality and diversity of the information that's being provided gets better and better. And decision makers are demanding more and better kinds of products. And also climate services are growing and evolving. And all of this has undoubtedly led to real benefits to society. So why can't we just stay business as usual? I mean, presumably, if we've gone the last 15 years or so doing what we're doing and learning from what we've been doing, by the time the next El Nino, the big El Nino hits, we will be that much more, the science will evolve that much further and the benefits will be that much greater. So I have a feeling that the panelists are going to disagree, and probably many of you in the audience as well. So what I want to end up at a place at the end of this where perhaps we've identified the ways in which we can realistically and practically further grow and evolve our science, ways that can lead to step changes, which is a very popular phrase in this conference, I've noticed. And step change, not baby steps, and when it comes to societal benefit. And identify those issues that still drag us down. And hopefully a lot of suggestions will come from the audience, and we'll continue as we beyond the walls of this auditorium. So at this point, I'm going to exercise my right as a moderator to shut up and start introducing our panelists. So first, I'd like to introduce Jim Buizer, and he's going to share a brief history of climate services and talk about the critical ingredients needed to improve them. And I'm going to give a shorter version of Jim's bio because he was here yesterday, and I think many of you already know. But Jim is a professor in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment and founding director of the Climate Adaptation and International Development Program in the Institute of the Environment at the University of Arizona. And he's also the co-PI along with Lisa Goddard on the International Research Applications Project funded by NOAA and supported by USAID. So, Jim.
All right.
So, yeah.
The mic thing.
I think we're going to all sit down and just kind of pass the mic.
Is this on? It's 2 units.
Now you have 1 minute left.
All right, in the next 4 minutes. Yeah, so I'm not sure I'm going to do what you asked me to do, Francesco, but I am going to go through a little bit of history and then just throw out some random sort of statements, and then we'll see if they get organized at some point. I'm a new academic. I haven't been in academia except for 4 years, and before that I was in university administration, and before that I worked for Mike Hall here at NOAA. And so my perspective is, built over, I would say, 30 years, but I will end with a little bit on our most recent research. But to begin with, I thought, okay, so how do we define a climate information or a climate service? And I thought, rather than go through a lengthy description, what I'll do is I'll tell you that I believe, we can talk about that later, that there's a difference between a climate information system and a climate information service or a climate service. Long before we even started using that phrase, things began. So in the beginning, modern era of moments in the development of a climate information service. And these are mine. Everyone has their own sort of milestones and moments, but I'm going to throw out about 6 or 7 of them that are markers in my mind. 1986, Keynes-Ebiak forecasted the first El Nino, beginning of a climate information service, at least in my mind. 1995, so almost 10 years later, the formation of what was then called the IRICP, International Research Institute for Climate Prediction. Very quickly, we took out the climate prediction and added the climate society, and we can go back and we can talk about that too. Regional Integrated Science and Assessment, the RESA program, Claudia Nuremberg got that going within NOAA. That's a national a climate information service at multiple timescales. In 1997-98, I also see Lisa Vaughn here, but she dreamed up and got started with what people have been talking about, the regional outlook, climate outlook forums that now have been adopted and are part of the World Meteorological Organization. 2006, NIDIS, National Integrated Drought Information System. Roger's probably gone now, but he mentioned this earlier. In 2006, many of you are probably familiar with Ed Miles's PNAS paper, An Approach to Designing a National Climate Service. 2012, the Global Framework for Climate Services. 2013, the International Research and Applications Program that you just mentioned, that is joint between the University of Arizona and IRI, funded by NOAA, and with some support from USAID. And then 2014, we heard yesterday we had the National Climate Assessment, and it's moved towards a sustained climate assessment. So there are a lot of things happening. This is a very U.S.-centric perspective, of course, because that's where I live. But nevertheless, a lot of things have been happening. Just to remind us, this has been in the making for a good 30 years. Okay, so I'm going to... In putting up a system, I'm not going to talk about the stakeholders are all different and you need to be user defined and all that, because that's been said. Mickey said it at least 19 times yesterday. So I'll just say that there's some tensions. The tension between, say, context and scale. The tension between doing a pilot in a very local place and needing to scale up in order to have some impact. How do you do that? How do you build in the scalability from the outset, and while we're doing the research and having the application at the local level, we're taking into consideration that context. Tension between products and processes of production. It's a critical ingredient, a set of ingredients. It's not just the products, of course, it's the process of production, the process of translation, the process of communication. All of this requires trust. For people to be able to accept other people's information or accept to be part of a team, we have to trust each other. Trust takes time. I learned that from my call. Another important thing is, what is our entry point? What is our entry point into the decision for the whole process and the whole system? Another thing I learned from my call, so be careful. You get into the climate business, you're going to have 7 billion stakeholders. You're going to have 7 billion people whose needs you're going to have to meet. And in fact, it's not like weather, because these people are going to bet their farm on what you have to say. Literally. Organize institutions around the challenges, and then revisit our notion of, we should revisit our notion of institutions. Because what worked fine for a slowly changing world, I'm going to sort of throw out there, isn't going to really work for the 21st century. And I would say that when we do so, we should design our governance of our projects, of our processes, of our systems, or of our climate information service, design the governance, just the governance that is necessary to accomplish the mission, not announce more. Only put as much as you need into the system. Form fully integrated teams of researchers and communities of practice and end users to co-produce climate information. Have it be. Jeez, okay. Yeah, all right. Okay, so then the last thing I'm going to say, because I think it's probably my most important point. Centralize that which is best done that way, and decentralize the rest in your system.
Actually, thanks, Stu. When we think of maximizing benefits and key barriers to that, what would you say are, you mentioned trust and figuring out entry points, but what are other challenges that you've seen in the development of climate strategies?
Sure. I've seen 30 years of really good anecdotes. We really tell good stories, but stories are interesting. It's just that we don't really have the data to back up our stories, and data is powerful. So if you put stories and data together, you really have an ability to be able to get beyond where we are. And you have to do that through evaluation. You need to build evaluation from the outset, so that you understand exactly what you're measuring according to the outcomes that you put out in front of you, and measure them, and do it in a rigorous way, so that you can come back and be able to demonstrate beyond the anecdotes, beyond the stories, in really defensible ways, in quantitative ways if possible.
All right, thank you, Jim. So next we'll hear from Simon Mason, who's going to address what we should be moving beyond and moving toward on the climate information side of things. So, Simon has been with the IRI since 1997 and has worked on seasonal forecasting since shortly after the death of Confucius. He assists national Met Services and regional climate centers to implement their climate services and works with humanitarian organizations to develop climate information fit for their purposes. He works closely with the World Meteorological Organization in defining and promoting standards, and was the lead author of the implementation plan for the Global Framework for Climate Services. He's also the developer of the Climate Predictability Tool, CPT, which is used throughout the world for making seasonal forecasts. Simon?
Thank you, Francesco. I think one of the reasons why I've been able to stay sort of sane working at the IRI for all these years is that I love running. And when I get sick and I go to the doctor, I've only got 3 questions. How long will I be off? Do I really have to take all these pills? And do I have to give up chocolate? I'm not interested in what the disease is, or what's going on medically. I'm just not interested. Okay, I want to know what are the things that I need to do in order to get better and get back on the road. And that's perhaps a little bit extreme in that case, but ultimately we have exactly the same problem with climate information. Okay, medical information is very complicated scientific information. Climate information is very complicated information. What we need to know is, how does this information inform what I need to do? Okay, and so I interpret the question is the current climate information that we're providing us making it clear what we need to do? Okay, no, of course not. I mean, you look at a seasonal forecast, the terciles. I mean, once you've worked out what the terciles are, I mean, how does that map onto any decision that anybody's going to make? It doesn't. Okay, and so there are some very obvious things that we do need to do. We need to improve the skill of the information. We need to provide clearer information products. But I'm reminded of there's a great quote from my favourite comedy series from the UK, The 40 Towers. And there's this hotel manager who doesn't get on very well with his wife. And he says, next contestant, Mrs. Basil 40 from Torquay, specialist subject, the bleeding obvious. And I'm not going to go into the bleeding obvious answers to this, okay? There's plenty of those, so I thought I would spend my few minutes perhaps talking about a few issues that we perhaps haven't thought about quite so obviously. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is, I feel that sometimes we're asking the wrong question. The skill of the seasonal forecast is not the problem. Okay, we've just heard a talk from earlier this morning from the reinsurance industry. These guys make billions of dollars on vast amounts of uncertainty. Okay, they're just very, very good at using very uncertain information. Okay, so the skill of the seasonal forecast, the skill of the longer range forecast, of the weather forecast, is not really the problem. The problem is not in the uncertainty. The problem is that the information, the uncertainty is in what are the impacts and what should I do about it. Okay, and so yes, obviously we need as climate scientists to try and improve the skill of the forecast, but that's not really what the limiting factor is. And so to me, I think one of the big problems that we're currently having with the information that we're producing is that we're actually very bad at indicating the uncertainty. I think we need to do a much better job at representing the uncertainty in the information. And I'd like to take a couple of examples why this is true. Okay, one. Okay, I've been to so many forecast forums where a forecast is presented as model output, and all they've done is to count up. We run this model 100 times, and you count up how many of these 100 runs say it's going to be wet. 70%. Okay, so we're 70% certain it's going to be wet. Rubbish. Okay, that's just 70% of the model runs are wet. We need to do a much, much better job at actually thinking through how do we go from our model run outputs to actually a sensible statement about the uncertainty. It seems to me we spend a vast amount of work running these very complicated computer models, and then we almost like ask a primary school question about the outputs. How many of these model runs are wet? Okay, we've got to do a much better job at that. I think the problem is even more serious at the climate change timescale, where we can't even use some relatively sophisticated statistical techniques. So, in my closing thoughts would be that I think what we can do is to do a much better job at indicating the real uncertainty in our information, and start addressing questions that are much more relevant to the decisions that people need to make.
Thanks. So I'm going to pose a question to you first, but it's something that I think we'd all want to address. But you, in your remarks, it seems like the onus is very much on the provisional, the provider side. Do you feel like the bulk of the onus should be on the science side?
I think, again, a simple answer here would be absolutely not. The onus is on both sides. Okay, the onus is partly on me to try and make my information useful. Okay, I've got a whole, we've got we've got some great work that's been done. There's been some excellent research, but we've been hopeless at translating that into understandable information. But at the same time, I think if your job is to save lives, okay, the onus is on you also to take advantage of what information is out there that might be of relevance. I'm currently unable to convert my climate information into a very clear indication of how many people are going to die. Okay? So, but the onus is on you to at least sit down and talk with me and let us try and think about this question together. So it's not the one side or the other. I think both sides have to do a lot of work to understand each other much more carefully.
At this point, I actually just wanted to bring in the audience a bit. If any of you have, maybe take one question about anything that Jim or Simon said, so that we don't wait till the very end, because we have 5 panelists. So, yeah.
Thank you, Alberto Tropoli. I have a question for Simon, please. I understand, I don't quite fully agree with what you say, that it's, the onus is on both, because, if you people that are supposedly going to use the information and they're not aware of what's available, then, you really need to get go out. But the question is really, what do you think should be done, and why it's not being done? I mean, when you say, we need to do more to present the probabilities and the uncertainty in a better way, what should be done, and why it's not being done in the last 10 years or more, I guess?
I think there's a few issues here. The one is that there has been some great work done in research in terms of how do we take, I'm going to talk mainly about the seasonal forecast, but how do we take the seasonal forecast models and convert those into sensible indications of uncertainty? And so there's some great work being done, including with CPC here. They've got a very sophisticated system. But it infuriates me that I go to a climate outlook forum in Africa, for example, and we're discussing the predictions, and then somebody says, yes, but if you look at this model from the International Supercomputing Center for mindless number crunching, they've got 70% of their ensemble members are indicating it's going to be above normal. Okay, so what? That model doesn't have any skill there, and we need to stop just putting up as forecasts these naive model outputs. We need to start actually taking the responsibility for, if we're going to put something up that is meant to be a forecast, it needs to be a properly calibrated forecast. There are procedures that we can use to do that. It is much harder at the climate change timescale, but again, what we need to do is we actually need to be analysing the climate model outputs. We've got a vast wealth of model runs, but the amount of effort that's been put into actually analysing exactly what those models say and how can we convert that into useful information. There's very, very few people doing that. It's hard work, but I think there's great opportunities for us to be using our climate expertise to understand what the model runs are saying and convert that into meaningful information, rather than just naive maps of model counts.
Joe, I saw your hand up. Do you have a question for?
Pretty much the same thing. I'm just looking for a specific example, and it seems like you'd have to be in partnership with somebody using that information to really, what's that 70% mean to a water resource person in Central Africa?
Sure.
So, absolutely. I fully acknowledge that the problem we have is that the number of questions that are climate relevant that need to be addressed are almost infinite, and we can't realistically answer an infinite number of questions. But there are some very simple things that we can do that we've been doing here at the IRI, for example, and that is moving beyond just presenting forecasts like terciles, probabilities. Okay, there's a great deal of work that goes into calculating those probabilities, and we're throwing away all the useful information about the. There's a lot more detail we could provide in different probabilities of different outcomes, and we've got a great map room here at the IRI where you can start asking those kind of questions. But we can present the information in much more flexible ways to then enable it to address much more, many more questions.
Thank you. So now I'd like to invite Andy Jarvis, who's going to focus on improving mechanisms to communicate information in timely, effective ways, especially when we consider reaching that last mile when it comes to providing climate services for agriculture. Andy Jarvis is the Director of the Decision and Policy Analysis Area in the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, CIATS, and is a flagship leader on the CGIAR research program for climate change, agriculture, and food security, and he's based in Cali, Colombia. He has 10 years research experience in developing countries to support the goals of alleviating poverty and protecting essential ecosystem services of importance to humanity. In 2003, Andy won the Crop Science Society of America C8 Genetic Resources Award, and in 2009 received the prestigious, I'm going to mess up his name, Edwin Nielsen Award for innovative research in bioinformatics and biosystematics.
Don't worry, I never knew how to pronounce it out. Okay, so I've been asked to thanks. Yeah. So I've been asked to talk about ag and how to kind of bring climate services to the benefit in ag. There's a lot of hype right now about this, when you go to countries and ask about climate services, you often find this, at the national scale, institutions always say, oh yes, we've got climate services. Very relevant for agriculture, they all exist. You go to a farmer, you ask them, do you get access to information on climate? And what? No idea. So the adoption levels of these things are very, very, very low. And I think there's a mentality in many cases of climate services stopping at the website. The interface of it's at the service and not the use. So I think that's the big challenge in agriculture is suddenly moving beyond having just the service providing information to the next level of users. And I think we heard some good examples yesterday from WFP of it working at kind of institutional levels for planning, for food security planning and things like that. But I think you have so few examples of really effective climate services that are going that last mile and actually reaching farmers, so that farmers are making robust decisions with climate information. So I think that is the key challenge that we have. When you kind of talk to farmers, there are 3 levels of complexity in terms of the decisions they need to make and where climate information can help them. I think in simple terms, when to plant. So deciding, or when not to plant, so deciding just planning their kind of cropping calendar, and so I can in a sec I'll tell you some examples from Senegal on that, and then with a little bit more complexity, what to plant, so varietal selection, things like that, and then even more detail on the how to plant, issues of management and so on. So these provide enormous challenges from the provision side of things. Often what farmers need are impossible asks to climate scientists, and there's nothing like the ag sector to get the climate scientists kind of knees trembling. And so I think that's a good challenge to have and to hear that, but it is a limitation, and the uncertainties involved often get very high when you've got to really question whether it's worth providing a service with those uncertainties. But so those are the kinds of information needs there. But I kind of focus back on something that one of the Mikes said, or maybe it was the other person that should be called Mike, in the first session of this kind of the three ends, and really bringing in feedback loops and end users into it. And I think that's really understanding how to get to the last mile and make information not kind of make. I think the vision should be that farmers are not only producing food, but they're also kind of consumers of information and producers of information at the same time. So this can only get better, these climate services, also if we're having feedback loops going back. So you have a climate service, you have a certain climate, a farmer makes an adjustment, we monitor what happens, we understand whether that climate information service was useful, how it changed things, and that improves back into the model so that we get better and better decisions being made. So that's the challenge. Now, how do you get that last mile? If anyone knows and can tell me, I'd love to hear. It's very, very challenging, and I think it's very region, country specific. One of our success stories has been in Senegal, where we've been working with, in that case, through kind of local level government, who have very efficient institutional kind of presence at local levels, who provide extension, working through radio, through rural radio, and multiple means to get information to farmers. And there it's been a kind of revolution in the sense that it's made agricultural extension sexy again. In the sense that farmers actually, now that they have new, novel information, it's not the same recipe that they're going and telling farmers year in, year out that they should do, but they have new information that the farmers really appreciate. So it's really actually stimulated, it's kind of a transformational change locally when climate information is introduced to the system. So in Senegal we've had a great success. In Colombia we have some successes, which is working through more the farmer organization level. So there you have good presence to be able to reach farm gates and reach farmers with information. And so in that case what we're doing is providing information of when to plant and what to plant. Doing models, seasonal forecasts over the next 4 to 6 months, and plugging that into our agricultural models to be able to say, well, this variety is likely to do better than another variety. So that really works when you have farmers at a kind of commercial level with access to credit, access to information, access to these things to be able to make informed decisions. So that it's different in every country, it's different in every context, but the importance of going that last mile. Otherwise, you've got these zombie climate services that are out there but actually not going anywhere. So that's the challenge.
Thank you, Andy. So the projects that you mentioned, are they what scale are they at? Are they tens of thousands or thousands of farmers? And the reason why I ask is because can we take steps to align science for better decision making that will reach millions of farmers and beyond that sort of project scale?
That scale out is the $1 million question and $1 million person question, how you get there. In Senegal, it was a pilot where we worked in one area, and we were talking there a question of thousands of farmers, and that really kind of functioned. And then national institutions took it up and promoted it more. And so the Senegal case now is reaching, we believe, 3 million farmers now, and a lot of that is thanks to rural radio. And it's the secret of success is partnership. It's lining up the climate and net people with the agricultural extension and also the local government people that are dealing with more general topics. So that's been a success there, and the communication channels. And so I think there's a huge amount of research to be done about how to communicate on these things. How do you, through a rural radio, when you've got 1 minute to give us a climate forecast, to give some climate information, how do you do that effectively in 1 minute? The person that's on the other end listening understands it, acts on it appropriately, and believes it and builds trust. That's a huge research area that I think needs a lot more work.
All right, so thank you, Andy. Ed Carr is next. He's going to be zooming in more on the social science considerations and research around the use and uptake of climate services. Ed Carr is a tenured professor and director of the International Development Community and Environment Department at Clark University, where he also directs the Humanitarian Response and Development Lab, HURDLE. Is it HURDLE?
It's hurdle.
I got to talk to you about that acronym.
It should be a hurdle. I worked hard for that acronym.
For nearly 20 years, he has worked in rural sub-Saharan Africa on issues of globalization, development, environmental change, living among and working with various rural communities. He has held numerous academic and professional positions in the world of development, including with USAID and the World Bank, and is the author of more than 50 pubs and reports on issues of development, adaptation to climate change, and the changing global environment.
Thank you. So I think what I'm going to talk about actually builds off of a lot of things that you've heard here, and then we'll express, I think I'm the young Mickey Glantz, so hold on to your seats. So I'm going to frame my comments, I'm going to start by framing my comments around something that came up the very first day, right? Which is that under El Nino events, we don't see more disasters. And of course, there are really kind of two foundational reasons for that. The first is that you're dealing with a physical system that's very, very sensitive to initial conditions, and that interacts, of course, with highly complex social systems that have really different levels of resilience to different local impacts from something like an El Nino event. So you put those two things together, you really don't know what kind of outcome you're going to get. So something I noticed from yesterday was we had sort of the projected potential impacts, precip impacts of El Nino, but I noticed that, as I recall, it was November, December, January, and I happen to do a lot of work in West Africa, so I was looking and I noticed that down in sort of Liberia, Sierra Leone, it looks like it's going to be really, really dry. And you'd say, oh no, that looks really bad, except no one's farming at that time of year. It's already dry anyway. So actually that's kind of irrelevant. So even though it's getting drier, doesn't matter. You have to understand the social system, you have to understand the farming system that you're interacting with if you're going to understand how these things become outcomes. And this then takes me to sort of where I become the young Mickey, which is I really would encourage us to not get too self-congratulatory about the social science we're actually doing in climate services right now, whether it's on El Nino or otherwise. If I'm to be provocative, as I was asked to be, I would argue that really most of the social scientific work in this realm could be best labeled as simplistic, and bluntly, if it was being published in something other than climate journals, wouldn't actually get published. I mean, for example, our work on gender is just embarrassing. I mean, we're still stuck in there are men, there are women, they're different. The social sciences went past that about 20 years ago. So, you know, at this point, we really have got to get much, much further down the road if we're going to do better. So in other words, what I guess I'm trying to say is we need more social science. We actually need better social science than what we're doing. We've got to get past weak explanations, what some folks in economics call story time, where you come up with really rigorous correlations and then start guessing at why it happened. I would argue we might have seen some of that in the last couple of days, actually. That is not programmable, folks. I've got folks from my old employers laughing right now, so they know what I'm talking about. We need to do, and this is where I would actually disagree with something Jim said, one of the things we desperately need is actually rigorous interpretive social science. And we do need quantitative evidence, but I'm really concerned about making sure we have the right information, the right data for the job, so to speak, which sometimes is quantitative, but a lot of times actually isn't. Why do I think this is important? I think this is important because this now goes to a number of the questions people have been trying to answer, or at least address here. If we're going to build meaningful climate services, and this is Jim's distinction here, if we're going to take this information and make it into something that people can use, that's a negotiation. We don't tell people what they need. That is never going to work out, okay? I tend to work mostly with farmers as well. Farmers know an awful lot about where they are and what their experiences are. That said, they don't necessarily know the full range of things that could be provided to them in terms of information. And engaging in a conversation and back and forth there is actually not straightforward at all. It's extremely complicated. And you really actually have to understand how people make decisions. See, and really kind of appropriate, by the way, at an El Nino conference, one of the things we often do, I think, is we can use stresses or catastrophe or disaster as an excuse to revert to kind of very colonial views of people and the information they should use. And that's a little bit distressing because that never actually plays out in the long run. What you need to do is work on having an informed conversation with the people who are going to be using this information, which means you don't need to know what they're doing, you need to know why they're doing it. Because there are deep logics to people's livelihoods around the world that are embedded not just in how you make a living, but in like fundamental things like people's identity. You're not going to transform how people make a living simply by providing new information. That is intersecting with all kinds of really complicated, challenging things. However, I will say that once you understand this logic, you can start to evaluate how the information you might have would intersect with the decisions that people are making, for good or for bad. At least from there, you can have a really good jumping off point for really interesting conversations. I would point out, that this has actually been done. There is not tons of this kind of work, but I mean, as an example, my lab's done this stuff now in Senegal, in Mali, in Zambia. It's built on work in Ghana. We can implement it. It doesn't cost that much. We actually can go kind of fast. All those things they say about the qualitative social sciences aren't true. So we can actually do all this, and we're working on the scalability question, because we tend to work in very small places, a community or two, but thinking about how you scale what we can learn about how people make those decisions to much larger data sets and whether or not that's generalizable, something we're actually wrestling with now. Last point. So what do we do about this? And the answer to me is, I heard the word partnership earlier. I would argue partnership, consortium, whatever. To be provocative, one last time to really hammer my point home, there's way too much social science dilettantism in this field. All right? You guys don't want me running climate models, as always. You don't want me doing math, actually. That's not a great idea. That said, I don't want you guys doing the social science. Please stop. We're here. We can help you. And there are right and wrong ways to do this work. There are right and wrong methods to use depending on the question you want to ask. And if we can work on building serious partnerships that actually bring the level of the social science in these areas up to the level of the physical science and get the same kind of attention, I think we have tremendous potential to start answering a number of the questions that you've been hearing here.
Thanks, Ed. So before we hear from Kanta, I just wanted to ask the audience, is there anything that any reacts to what Andy and Ed mentioned? From Carr.
Okay. Hi, Chuy from NASA Goddard. And then that begs the question of, give us a little story of how something has worked in Senegal, and have you and Andy crossed paths in Senegal at all?
We haven't crossed paths, which proves that our partnerships are pretty incomplete. In fact, as he was talking, I'm like, I need to talk to him. No, so I mean, I'm trying to think, because I have like 4 reports we just finished, they're sort of jumbled in my head right now. But let me give you an example of something that actually crosses both Senegal and Mali that we saw about like what kind of things happen. First of all, I said men, women, don't do that, because like not all women are the same, not all men are the same. One of the things we found is that we started breaking down, figuring out who was vulnerable to what. They did map to different kinds of identities, typically gender and seniority, that kind of intersection there. But one of the things we ran into is, those identities then map very strongly to particular livelihood activities, and even particular crops you grow. Which means you don't just flip out of growing a crop just because someone gives you information that that particular crop is not well suited. If you do that, you actually open yourself up to really significant social sanctions. So, for example, someone can give you information that tells you, absolutely you should plant this crop because it will improve your yields and your income. That's our view on that particular decision. That farmer is negotiating something substantially more complex, including the fact that if she makes more money, it might challenge her husband's identity and he might beat her. And I hate to say this, but that's in our data sets. That is a sanction, an elevated sanction, but a sanction that is imposed upon women who get out of line and start farming things that they, quote, shouldn't be. So it's a little tough for us to put information out and say, oh, you're making a logical decision. Strikes me as rather logical to not want to get beaten by your husband. So this is where things get really complex. I mean, we're sub-household when I talk about the data sets we're using. Like, we can talk about individual actors in the household. We kind of have to get to the decision making we're talking about. But I do want to make sure that I don't want to live in a household. I want to be able to take the processes we're talking about and what we know and integrate it to all these different kind of data sets at larger scales to help inform how we understand them.
Next question. You had a question?
Okay. Hi, my name is Maureen. I work with K-International. So this question is for Andy, but I'll be happy for Ed to jump in and say something about it. So I'm just wondering, we've been hearing a lot about capacity for Met services and climate science to produce climate information increasing, improved models, but what about the capacity for people to actually use this information? What's happening with it? Is it changing at all? And does it match the capacity to actually generate and communicate and get this information out? Maybe from your experience in Senegal, but I'll be happy to hear Ed's responses to this as well. Thanks.
Wow, that's a good question. I mean, this is all about behavior change, right? And so climate information is designed to somehow impact on behavior change, so that people do things differently somehow. But for them to be able to kind of make that change of decision, they have to go through already a kind of behavior change in receiving, understanding, trusting, and using that information. And that, you know, I think there's a lot of naivety that you just throw out information and this is going to be useful, and suddenly they're going to jump up and say, hey, you know, that's great. I'm gonna do this differently. It's a very long process. In Senegal, our experience there was something that I've seen kind of from hearing the last 2 days, which I find fascinating. There's been so much luck in this field. And I think in Senegal we had an amazing amount of luck, in the sense that the first year that we put it out, it was all about just predicting when the rains will come. And if you can predict that right, then farmers kind of get their fields in, the seed in time. They get market advantage by harvesting first. There's all sorts of benefits if they get that right. And so it just happened in the first year we got it right. And so the whole design around it was about building trust and building awareness kind of in that first year. So we had areas, we had a farm where half of the field was or we had a number of farmers do this, half of the field was doing exactly what the forecast was saying. So it was the recommendation as per down to the letter of what extension with the climate information was saying. In the other half, the farmer, right, do what you would normally do. And then we were monitoring. And so it was very much a kind of participatory, community-based appraisal of the information in that first year. And that's actually continued. We continued doing that. And we got lucky for the kind of first 2 or 3 years. I think now we had an unlucky year. But hopefully, I think there's a huge amount of luck in that first rollout if you're going to be successful. And I think you've got to be very careful to not launch information if you're uncertain about it. There's a real sensitivity, I think, there.
Because I know we're short for time, super quick plug. I either edited or wrote something like 500 pages on the Mali Agromet Advisory Program. USAID supported all that work. The reports are public. And one of the big findings we had were there were 2 big factors that governed whether or not people were actually able to use the climate services. One were the social factors of who gets to make decisions. The other was who owned a plow and draft animals. And it turns out that's mostly about 15% of the men. And they're the ones able to use it. Lots of people heard the advisories, but only that small chunk could actually use it. So I think it speaks a lot to is their capacity to actually use these, even if they're deemed as useful and actionable.
You've been very patient, so...
We're just the backup dancers.
That's right. So here to bring it all home. No. Kanta, Kumari, and Chuy, who shares the perspective, who's going to share the perspective of development organizations, how to get science to inform development for societal benefit at scale. And she's also going to discuss opportunities and concrete areas for engagement. Kanta is the lead environmental specialist with the climate policy team at the World Bank, where she works on the knowledge agenda on resilience. Most recently, she led the development of the climate and disaster risk screening tools and coordinated the bank's work on Turn Down the Heat series. She's also the World Bank's focal point for the pilot program for climate resilience, PPCR, working with bank teams and participating countries to nurture shared learning, knowledge exchange, and to advance the climate resilient agenda. Earlier, she worked in the Middle East, North Africa region, and prior to that with the Global Environment Facility. She has a PhD on environmental studies from the University of East Anglia in the UK.
the end-to-end. Okay, so it's very hard to come after an esteemed panel, but I'll try. I think the one thing that I heard consistently, I think over the days and just now was, I think, about the scale issue. I mean, we have a lot of successful pilots and successful projects. So what does this really mean for development organizations like the World Bank, where I think there is a recognition that for us to address our poverty mission, where currently you have 1 billion people, as Richard mentioned yesterday, who are less than 125 a day. And now we have this target that we set for ourselves to say that by 2030 we want to eradicate extreme poverty to less than 3% of the population. 3% too many, but it's a target. And not only to eradicate the extreme poverty, but to sustain, the poverty, to sustain and have boost the shared prosperity. These are extremely important targets, but the big crippling factor that has come out in some of the recent analytical work, that reports that we put out just a week ago on shock waves, is that climate is a very important part of that challenge. So for an institution that lends and has grants, equities, loans in the order of 60 billion, and it's not just, and 20 billion of this going to the poorest countries, to address the kind of livelihood challenges we just talked about, we really can't continue to just work at that small scale. And it is a real challenge. And it's not just, I think, for the agriculture sector or for the extreme event. It's really for the infrastructure as well. Because one thing that I think that in the recent analysis we put out is that one of the best adaptation strategies is, we have to adapt by 2030 and do it rapidly, inclusively, and have climate-informed development. Rapid inclusive, the bank can take care of. But the climate-informed, I think, is where I think we come up with these obstacles. And all the kinds of stuff that the colleagues here talked about is what we need. We need that forecasting, we need more precision, we need less uncertainty, we need it to be contextualized for the kind of information that we need. So the question here is that, how do we change that process? The good news is that, I think Max talked about it yesterday, we can't do things, coming in a small way here and there. I think those are important things to do. We should continue. I think that's where the pioneering work will happen. That's where the proof of concept is. But we need, I think, from your community and our development community to really create those rungs of the ladder so that we can climb upwards. And here, I think, we need to take advantage of the larger planning processes that are in place. And I think Michael mentioned, it's not the plans, it's the planning processes. So what we're finding is that, having worked with the pilot program for climate resilience, 7 years ago, when we arrived in the countries, we were trying to explain what is resilience, what do they need to do, what is climate information. 7 years later, we're in a very different conversation. There isn't a single client out there who doesn't know what their needs are, who doesn't believe in it. And I think that's the change of the conversation and that transformation that has happened, and we need to then bring those institutions involved. Higher rights agencies are very important, but they've been very lowly paid agencies and very low in the hierarchy of the system. And the conversation we are having now is, how do you elevate their importance? How do you really bring the accountability back to the ministries of finance and ministries of planning to recognize these are fundamental changes? So then I think the question is, how does the science community relate to that? So when Francesco asked me about how does science, how does science have to evolve to give societal benefits, I thought, well, I'd like to ask a question. The question was, how does development need to be framed differently to really harness that science? Because I think the reality we are recognizing is, whatever investment we're doing, we do need some kind of climate-informed, climate information or climate service, whether it's the road that we're constructing in terms of design standards. So I think when we talked yesterday of us needing the interdecadal information, that's the kind of information we need beyond the sort of quick, seasonal forecasting. So I think my sense is that I think we just have to change the conversation has changed, and I think as a community we need to go beyond, I think, and take that challenge up. I think take it up to scale. I don't have the answers, but I do think that somebody here mentioned about partnerships. I think partnerships are extremely important. And Walter mentioned yesterday, I don't think we should all reinvent ourselves to become every other expert. I think that would be a Christmas tree. But the question I have is, for an institution like IRI, which is really a science-based institution that is looking for applications, and then you have development institutions like us, who work in the development where we are constantly having to deliver and have that applied information, then it seems that there should be a marriage of the two, which is a win-win. And how we can actually bring that to bear, I think, is a real challenge. But there are good examples out there. There are things that are already happening. And I'd like to share, the case of Zambia. Zambia is a country that has taken climate change very seriously, climate variability, climate change. And through multiple investments from multiple donors, and more recently with the pilot program for climate resilience, when they put in place their resilience program, they really thought through the process of how things were going to be transformed from the level of the communities right up to the ministries of finance who make those decisions. And they put in place a process that you have a very consultative process with the communities, understanding what their challenges are, understanding what their needs are, understanding when the droughts come and when the seasonal patterns are changing, and doing the right things. And then making sure that that fed into development district plans, and those district plans went up and got funded back. And so sort of you have a sustained system that gets people out of poverty. And that's the system that I think we need to create. But a critical element of that has been getting the right climate information to bear on those communities, and that's been done, partly with their strengthened hydromet systems, but also hydromet agencies, but also I think working in partnerships to get those climate services. So we do see these successful examples in multiple places that are actually transforming at scale. So you have a country now that has recognized it and is taking action with that responsibility. One last thing I wanted to say is, I think the end becomes very long, and because of the urgency of time, we need to decrease the number of ends. So the other responsibility that the community of scientists here needs to have is, how do we transfer that capacity and that knowledge base to that next satellite station so that you decrease the number of end-to-end you have and increase the uptake, while I think the communities here need to continue to excel and build the pioneering front and go further. Thank you.
So I'll just use my voice. Does anyone have a question or a response directly to what Kanta just said? Here, you can use, oh, he's coming.
So I think that's about something that Kanta just mentioned. We agree. We shouldn't be reinventing ourselves all the time. It makes much more sense to establish the right partnerships, mainly because there are already institutions that have been doing this for decades, and they're doing it right. It doesn't need to be integrated. And I think in this end-to-end story is something similar. The truth is that in most communities there are already networks through which knowledge flows. Knowledge flows, and so most of the good, successful stories that I know are those that took advantage of those existing networks. And so, in our experience, we at the IRI, we learned that very early in our process. We were supposed to be end-to-end. And in fact, when you have a climate scientist interacting with a farmer in Africa instead of with a peer in AGU, it's a lot more stimulating. Suddenly your work is affecting the life of a human being. But it's so inefficient. How many farmers can you reach when you have an extension service that is reaching thousands of farmers? several extension services that are reaching millions, or the CG, who is reaching millions of farmers. So I think in the same way that I believe we need to establish partnerships and strengthen and take advantage of our comparative advantages, I think we also need to take advantage of these existing networks and maybe try to strengthen those networks instead of trying to reach end users. All of us, all of us, especially in science, very rarely we should be trying to reach end users.
I just wanted to say, I think that's a good point, and I hate the word mainstreaming, right? But I think it really is, I think where you're coming in is, I think, to come in and catalyze things to happen. Because you really don't want to create a parallel system. Agriculture extension workers exist. They exist for multiple purposes, and now you want to use them to also convey this type of information. But you want to be able to build their capacity, to build their understanding, to absorb or to get the right kind of focus, or maybe even to create them, but to be able to deliver to the system. So I think it's a new area of work, and so we're very focused on sort of saying that we want to meet everybody, meet every end user, but you don't want to come in with a duplicative system. So that system exists, but you need to have a few turnkeys and catalytic steps to make that happen, right?
Any other questions? And I also, to anyone, to any of the panelists.
Okay, Cedric, Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. So at the risk of stating the obvious, but I think it's something that every climate scientist does, we randomly assume that if we produce information, that we go to our users and we say, if you just unlearn your bad habits, but we don't know if those habits are good or bad. We don't know that. And that's one of the wrong assumptions with many of the pilot projects that you see happening, especially in the smaller countries or the countries with little capacity, because you bring in the new information and you assume that they will unlearn the bad habits. This only happens if you have consortia or partnerships or whatever. And so there are countries in which this works, but we assume that because there's a pilot project that has worked in a certain country, that it will be transferable or transposable to another country. No, it doesn't. So I think that when we design our programs, our funding programs, we really need, from the climate scientist side, to have a much better understanding of this.
Lisa, did you have a question?
Yeah.
So Andy, you're our Ethiopia inspector person on the panel. You talked a lot about the role of communication in the agricultural sector, getting information out there. I'm just curious, in the disciplinary world of agriculture, what research could connect to this bigger picture that we're talking about?
There's huge opportunity. So you have a whole modeling world in agricultural research that have been developing models to optimize management and all of these things, and suddenly the climate information service is this whole new opportunity for making it even more relevant. So I think from the agricultural modeling community, putting that together with climate information service and climate science that's a whole new kind of use case with potentially tremendous impact. But I think also vice versa, right? I mean, I think in agriculture you have a huge amount of body of work on adoption studies, right? And I think that concept of adoption studies needs to be applied on climate information services as well. You see the service as of the information and the use of that as kind of an adoption process, and I think you could it's a useful approach to take to try and understand if what you're doing is good, and improving it. And so that's been very much mainstreamed over the years in agricultural research, and I think you could transfer that one back.
And then selection.
All right. Yeah, so Cedric, actually, the social sciences, and I'm going to look ahead to see whether he agrees, social and behavioral sciences actually does find, the literature shows where there are some transferable things from place to place. And so the idea of using a pilot and the lessons learned from that, you take those which are things that are transferable, you don't have to restart those, and then you adjust according to the specific differences of each place. So I don't think we should get too terribly caught up in that absolutely every village is different from every other one when it comes to what we're doing. And to Kanta's point, actually, I was going to say, your bank or your finance ministers are going to be looking for some sort of ROI, however defined, some return on investment. And in fact, Ed, you disagree with something I didn't say. I didn't say that we didn't need better descriptive science. Just saying, in addition to that, quantitative ROI calculations. I'll give you a very specific example quickly. In Jamaica, we were asked by USAID to go in and see if we could determine the value of the climate, the drought product that was produced by CIMH and IRI and others for 2014-2015 drought. And because he'd been hearing stories that it had been useful, we went in a really rigorous way. We evaluated that and have arrived at a number. It's between $10 and $30 million of losses averted because of that forecast came in. The investment was probably in a couple $100,000, and now we can start telling, look, if you make this kind of investment, here it is. It's better than the answer being, they say it's a bunch of money. You have to have numbers. Yeah, and so anyway, that's what I meant. So I think that the last thing I would say is that I think that behavioral science, social sciences is in there. We need better quality. We need more and better quality. Behavioral sciences is frankly pretty much missing in our community. And I think that that's an area that is really lacking.
Well, you suggested that one should be provocative, so I'm going to do so. You know, my experience in India suggests to me that we need to still do a lot of work on how we generate recommendations for a given situation. Take last year, this year, it was supposed to be an El Nino, it turned out to be one. It was supposed to be a drought, it turned out to be one. But the recommendations that were given seem to be not at all appropriate. For example, although we didn't have too much rain by the July, people said now you distribute seeds again because you have to try planting again. Now, if one had looked at climate variability data, you would have known that the chance of survival of the second seed was also none. And so a lot of money gets wasted in these kind of things because people don't analyze with farmers their experience of previous droughts and with the 100-year data that we have. What are the chances of a second sowing succeeding at all? And it is these kind of mistakes that are made. So while in doing climate science we are rigorous, and we do not seem to be as rigorous in generating the recommendations. Now they recommend, please don't plant this but plant something else. In lot of places, the other thing which was soybean was also failed. So a lot of money was wasted and we had hundreds of farmer suicides. And I'm afraid no scientific body takes responsibility for the suicides that occurred. Although I think we ought to, because we are generating recommendations with science that is not as rigorous as the climate science that is generating the forecast. We are not using enough information on climate variability when we generate the strategy. And we are not talking to farmers to find out from their experience. I agree with Ed about colonial attitude, and that is reflected in our whole approach of extension service. As if we have all the wisdom and we can transmit it to the extension people. and transmit it to the farmers. I find that often farmers are much more aware of what to do with their complex systems than the people who generate recommendations are. And I think this is a major lacuna that we have to face, and by just roping in social scientists, this is not going to be cured. This is genuine interdisciplinary science, which requires, the agricultural science input, climate variability, information input, and genuine collaboration with farmers on what are the options that they should explore. It is as if we go and preach to them some strategies which they know are not good, and they end up losing. So my feeling is that we are just continuing the colonial attitude. Now the colonials are the scientists, and the farmers have to take it and leave it. But we are not bothering to, be accountable. And we are not assessing the impact of the recommendations that we ourselves make as rigorously as we should in any science.
So we only have maybe time for a short response.
So I would argue it's the colonial lack of social sciences. First, I'm going to be slightly boring and non-provocative by actually agreeing with Jim. It's an absence of behavioral science. That's absolutely right. I'll also agree with him on valuation, which is a very, very useful thing. I would not discount that at all. But it's actually Jim's point about the lack of behavioral science is exactly what you're talking about at that end of it. That to me is a really big gap that would start to fill some of this recommendation gap that we have right now.
Sorry, now I was going to come back, sorry, to a point that Jim made about rate of return or return on investments. I think the bank did, and I think together with USAID and others, a study on the economic valuation of hydromet systems, and we've done a piece earlier, and it really showed that there was a 1 in 7 return, when you had more accurate forecasts, and it paid governments to actually invest and upgrade their hydromet systems. And I think this is really catching on, particularly also from the fact that a lot of governments get hit by extreme events that wipes out their whole treasury. So I think this is why this issue, I think, is really important, and it is being taken, and we really have an opportunity to change the whole dialogue and bring in science and capacity building in a much more systematic way at scale.
You have a minute?
Well, apparently we do.
I think something important has emerged here, and the words will fail me, so bear with me. Jim brought up in his initial comment the problem of scaling in a general sort of way, and each of you reinforced that in one way or another. It was universal. And it strikes me that a new term needs to be introduced. I don't know what it is, but for the moment I'll use the term scale matching as a subject we will all think about and explore. And let me switch to a time scale example, because it's the only one I have. In electronics, when you build an amplifier or a speaker system, you have to do something called impedance matching. That's their term. Which means the inherent frequency of the signal you're generating has to be of some use, or has to be compatible with the inherent capability of what you're addressing. Therefore, what I think I extract from this session and the last 15 or 20 years of struggles that you all have done is a need to pause now and say, all right, we've got a lot of anecdotes, we have successes, we have failures. It's clear that what we're working is a probabilistic problem. And you need to ask yourselves, as those generating information, you need to ask yourselves, to whom are we addressing our information? Who are we trying to inform? Now, I'll be very naive, go back to the spatial scale, and that the naivete I will show is about decision systems. But I'm going to suggest that there must be in every social system an actual hierarchy of decision makers. In a casino, there's the pit boss who can get upset because somebody just won 7 hands, and there's a lot of money changing hands in the wrong direction. But he has a boss who's more philosophical about that and understands that that's going to happen. And then that boss has a boss. And what I'm getting at is you need to match the scale of what you're generating and its maximum utility with who in the social system you're trying to inform, and select carefully and articulate what you're trying to do, and articulate equally the ones that you know you can't inform. Maybe the individual farmer, which was useful when you were in the anecdotal phase of your experiment, really isn't the target of your information. Maybe it's someone higher up in the social hierarchy. I would call that for the moment scale matching, and I think you'll collectively have surfaced a really, really intriguing intellectual problem.